everyone.
Hello everyone.
Welcome back to our book club. I am Miss Maka.
And I am Mr. Deril. Today we are going to talk about a classic of British literature, Wuthering Heights.
By Emily Bronte.
Very good. It's a lot darker than our previous Bronte, Charlotte's work.
Yes, maybe because she used lots of Gothic, some kind of symbols in her writings.
It's a lot more psychological darkness as well. And
exactly.
It's actually interesting. I find it interesting, very interesting.
Of course. But Mr. Deril, before we go into details of the book itself, let's talk about our agenda. So traditionally, we start with the vocabulary. Then we'll continue to talk about the author. After, we will talk about the summary of the book.
From there, we will talk about characters, very important in this book. Each one is very unique. And then we look at the setting. It is a Gothic novel after all, and Gothic novels are known for their dark setting. And we'll look at the main themes of the book, of which there are a few.
Yes, definitely we will end our program with the conclusion part, and we will give you an interesting homework.
And I look forward to reading the questions.
Of course. Now let's start with the vocabulary, Mr. Deril.
Yes, as usual, we've chosen 8 words to focus on, and it will be used in our discussion, as well as you can find it in the book itself when you read it. Let's move on to the first word. The first word. It is an adjective, and it is bare. Bare. This is when you don't really have too many decorations on something. You kind of keep something very simple in appearance.
Shishveli, ubralo.
Our next word is the verb to betray. To betray. This is when you break a promise to someone.
Ghalati, katsema.
Our next word is a noun, grave. Grave. This is the place in the ground where someone is buried after death.
Saplavi. I'm not surprised that this word is in this story.
In such a Gothic novel.
Yeah.
Our next word is tenant. Tenant, yes, that is how it's pronounced, tenant. This is a person who pays someone money to live in their house or apartment.
Mdgmuri. Would you say it in Georgian? Mdgmuri.
Yes, I'd try. I will
okay.
try. Mdgmuri.
Okay, cool. Well done, Mr. Deril.
Was that good?
Yeah.
Good. Our next word is landlord. Landlord. Now, this is the person that the tenant would pay his money to. A person who owns a house where you would stay.
Memamule.
Our next verb is to tease. To tease. This is just when you make someone angry just for fun.
Garizianeba, datsinva.
Our next word is grief. Grief. You feel grief when you're sad because someone has passed away or died.
Tsukhareba.
And our last word is funeral. Funeral. This is the event that happens when people have passed on, have died, and people come together.
Dakrzalva.
Well, now I think we have a question for our audience on the vocabulary words.
Yes, Mr. Deril, we do. So what is the connection between a landlord and a tenant?
As I remember, the landlord is a person who rents his own property to a tenant. And a tenant is a person who pays money to a landlord to live in his property.
Yeah,
Excellent.
That's exactly.
That was a great answer.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's move on to our next section, and that is the author. We have one of the sisters of perhaps one of the most famous of the British writing families, the Bronte family. We've spoken about Charlotte before. Today we're talking about Emily Bronte. Emily Bronte. Born in 1818 in Yorkshire, England, and died in 1848. The family actually has two more sisters, Charlotte and Anne, both of whom wrote novels, and a brother as well, Branwell, who we'll speak about a bit later. So she is an English novelist and poet as well, who produced only one novel, Wuthering Heights. It's a highly imaginative work of passion and hate. And it's amazing that she's only produced one novel, and yet her fame has built up to the point where we are discussing that one novel.
Yes. So what about the sister story? So in 1842, Charlotte and Emily, they went to Brussels to learn foreign languages. But however, her aunt died, and Emily returned to Yorkshire. In 1845, Charlotte accidentally came across some poems by Emily. And this led to the discovery of three sisters, like Charlotte, Emily, and Anne had written poems. Three of them wrote poems. A year later, they published a volume of verse. It contained 21 of Emily's poems. And later criticism has accepted the fact that Emily is the one who is considered to be a true genius in her poems.
Very good. There's another difference between Emily and Charlotte's writing style. Emily makes no use of the events of her life, unlike Charlotte, who does make use of events of her life. And Emily does not use coincidences and that kind of thing in novels to make the plot advance. She has very strict focuses on psychological effects of the way people think. A small bit of controversy as well. There is a few people that say that Emily did not write Wuthering Heights maybe entirely, and maybe she was helped by the brother, Branwell, to write that novel. Right after he died, and he died young, his friends said that he had written the novel.
So maybe it's not a real fact.
Yeah, it's not a majority opinion, but it is a minority opinion. Okay, we have a question for the audience now. Who can tell me the difference between Charlotte's writing style and Emily's writing style?
Jane Eyre is a Bildungsroman, which means the story is about the growth of the main character. Wuthering is a darker psychological gothic novel.
Very good. And that is exactly the difference between Charlotte and Emily.
Yes, and from the summary later we will see how dark this story is actually.
It does get quite dark.
Yes. So let's move on to the summary part. So Wuthering Heights was published in 1847. This is a novel by Emily Bronte. So this intense novel is distinguished from the other novels in that period by its dramatic, poetic and Gothic presentation, as our member of the audience has mentioned, and by its unusual structure. It is about the impact of the orphan boy named Heathcliff on the two families of the Earnshaws and the Lintons in a remote Yorkshire district at the end of the 18th century, and his revenge on both families extending into the younger generation.
Very good. Yeah, it's important to remember the two families, Earnshaws and Lintons, and we'll keep coming back to them again and again and again all the way through the novel.
Yes.
So in the late winter months of 1801, a tenant comes to Wuthering Heights, the house there, and his name is Lockwood, and he writes down this tale in his diary. It's about two households, the Earnshaw family that lives at Wuthering Heights and the Linton family that lives at Thrushcross Grange. At Wuthering Heights, the owner of the manor, Mr. Earnshaw, one day brings back an orphan boy to live with his family. So he takes pity on the boy, brings him back, and he raises him up as his own son. But complications start. So Catherine falls in love with this orphan boy that has come into her family.
Yes, so the complications really started. 3 years later, Mr. Earnshaw dies, and his oldest son, Hindley, inherits the house. But what about Heathcliff? He continues his close relationship with Catherine, however. So one night, Catherine is bitten by a dog, so she's forced to go to the Thrushcross, where Mrs. Linton works to make her a proper lady. So after she returns back to Wuthering Heights, So she has already started to like Edgar Linton. So, and her relationship with the moody Heathcliff grows more complicated. Yeah.
Meanwhile, the oldest son in the Earnshaw family, where Heathcliff was brought to, he becomes an alcoholic with the death of his father. He becomes more violent and cruel and abusive towards Heathcliff, his stepbrother. Eventually, Catherine's desire for social advancement, social improvement, makes her decide to marry Edgar Linton, so the boy from the other family. Although she still remains in love with Heathcliff, which is quite a complication, as you can see. So she loves Heathcliff, but decides for social advancement purposes to marry Edgar Linton. Heathcliff is, of course, depressed over this, and he runs away from the house and the family, stays away for 3 years, and then when Catherine and Edgar get married, he comes back. However, he comes back a changed man. He comes back mysteriously rich, so he's now super rich, and he immediately starts seeking revenge on people he thinks have wronged him. And this is when everything gets worse in the novel.
Yes, and again, another death happens. So, and this time Hindley dies, and after that Heathcliff is the one who inherits his house. He also inherits Thrushcross Grange by marrying Isabella Linton. Isabella is the sister of Edgar. So, but you know, he treats her very cruelly, and they have a daughter named, of course, Catherine, but during this story we will call her Cassie, and in the book she's also called short, and like with a short form, Cassie. So the older Catherine becomes ill, gives birth to a daughter from Edgar, and dies. Shortly afterwards, Isabella flees to London and gives birth to Heathcliff's son, and he is named Linton. She keeps the boy with her there.
Okay. So a lot of characters and a lot of things are happening.
Yes.
We're now moving to the second generation. So that was the first generation, Heathcliff, Catherine, Edgar, and Isabel. Now we're moving to the second generation. 13 years pass. Young Cathy grows up at the Grange with no knowledge of Wuthering Heights. Soon afterwards, Isabella dies. Linton comes to live with Heathcliff, but Heathcliff behaves very badly with his son now.
Yes, and 3 years later, finally, Cassie, little Cassie, has a chance to visit Wuthering Heights, where she starts a secret romance with Linton. So they spend a lot of time together. Heathcliff hopes that if Cassie marries Linton, his legal claim upon Thrushcross Grange will be legal. Okay, so and he will have even more chances to have a revenge.
He's after revenge after all.
Yes, all the time.
And it all kind of comes to an end when Heathcliff forces the young Cathy to marry his own son Linton. And after the marriage, both Edgar and Linton die. And Heathcliff has now attained his revenge. He's got everything. He's got Wuthering Heights and he's got Thrushcross Grange in his name.
Yes, but shortly after this happened, walking on the moors, Heathcliff finally dies also. Herton Earnshaw, Hindley's son, inherits Wuthering Heights with Casey, of course. So they soon plan to get married. So maybe this is the end, kind of happy ending of these two families.
Possibly, but I think there's just too many psychological things that have happened before, and it makes it more of a tragedy, I think, in my opinion.
Okay, now after we had our summary, let's ask a question to our audience. So from the summary we can get that Heathcliff was only obsessed with revenge. Like in real life, is it ever justified to have revenge on anyone?
Well, revenge is usually destructive, so in my opinion, it continues the conflict instead of ending it.
Very good answer. So why do you think Emily Bronte makes a story about revenge, the main novel she's ever written about?
I think that it is even more gothic, so it adds some kind of flavor, I don't know. So it depends, like, what was the message from her? What do you think?
I agree. I think revenge, it's more complicated. And maybe Emily was showing her skill in telling a story about revenge perfectly.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on to characters now. That is our next section of discussion. And we are going to focus on 5 of them. So let's talk about the first character, Heathcliff. It centers around this character, and the desire to understand him is what pushes us to keep reading. He's not easy to understand, however, and he cannot be explained even, no matter how much we try later on. There's just no way to get to the heart of this character.
Yes, what about our second character? This is Catherine. Her actions are driven by her social ambitions, but from the book we can also see that she is very motivated by impulses, but she seems unsure whether she wants to look like a kind of bad guy Heathcliff or is inspired by Edgar. Okay, but many critics argue that her decision to marry Edgar Linton is a rejection of her true nature and a surrender to cultural expectations.
Very good. Let's move on to the next character, Isabella Linton. She is kind of Catherine's opposite in a way. Whereas Catherine represents wild nature, Isabella represents culture and civilization. And this is kind of her best character and her weak character as well.
Yes, and what about Edgar? So why did Catherine actually choose Edgar? Because he is born and raised gentleman. He is graceful and well-mannered. But actually we can also see that this is kind of a weakness for him in his rivalry with Heathcliff. As the readers can see from the earliest descriptions of Edgar as a spoiled rich kid, his refinement makes him helplessness.
Very interesting. Okay, we have a question for the audience. Now, what kind of character does Catherine show by choosing Edgar instead of Heathcliff, whom she loves, remember?
In my opinion, it shows us that she was following the social expectations even though she was a very strong-willed person. Also, I have to admit that she neglected her heart desire, and some people said that this was the reason why this misfortune happened.
That was a great answer. Yes, I think Emily, although she displays that Catherine chooses social mobility, she's very critical of it because everything goes worse from that decision.
Yes, definitely. Maybe she made a wrong decision in this case.
Okay, let's move on to the setting. As you know, we look at the when and the where of the story. Okay, well, I will start off with the when, Ms. Maka. When Bronte writes this book, the English economy is doing really badly, and there's a lot of fear over the lower classes from the aristocratic classes. They fear what the lower class could do if they became powerful or if they revolted or started a revolution. And a lot of that fear is behind maybe the way that Heathcliff is perceived to be a negative character.
Yes, but in literature, the smoky, threatening, miserable factory towns were often represented in religious terms, and they were compared to hell.
Let's move on to the where now. It is significant that Heathcliff begins life as a homeless orphan. At this time, the new middle class were ready to move up with a good business idea or move down if they had poor results for their business ideas. And so a lot of them were insecure about their position. This is another reason why Heathcliff is perceived as this kind of outsider who's coming in to complicate their lives.
Okay, now it's time for our main themes of the book. One of the main themes that we should focus on is destructive love. So we can see that love is a real destruction here because it causes confusion, it causes conflict, and even it causes the wish to revenge on people.
Right, it's not easy to see whether Emily is making these romantic heroes heroic or if she's blaming them in some way for the misfortune that happens from their actions. So it's a very complicated perspective that she takes up.
So yeah, ultimately Wuthering Heights presents a vision of life as a process of change and celebrates this process over and against the romantic intensity of its principal characters.
Very good. Another main theme is social class. Now, social class often influences the motivations of characters in Wuthering Heights. Catherine's decision to marry Edgar is a very big example. And I think the Lintons, they behave badly as well in their own way because they're also unsure about their social position.
Yes, and this example, good example of transformation is shown by Heathcliff. So from some kind of laborer, he became a gentleman, okay, after he got some kind of secret money, but still he gets this status. So, of course, money was the thing that would determine your upper class or lower class.
Okay, very good. Ms. Maka, I think it's time to wrap up the lesson for today.
So, we talked about the author. This is Emily Bronte.
Then we had a look at the summary, and you know it is a tale of two families over two generations and the complications that happen between them.
Yes, so I will not tell the characters, I will not give you the list, but we had characters from two families actually, and they were in conflict.
In the setting, remember it's set in the 19th century, the 1840s, and in the Yorkshire moors where the Bronte sisters lived.
Yes, and the main themes that were destructive love and social class.
Now we move on to our homework question.
Oh, what is our homework, Mr. Darrell, for today?
First, I'd like to thank our audience for participating in the questions earlier, but now we have a question for the TV audience, and it is this. We have seen two generations from these two tragic families. Imagine that the story continues for a third generation. So, what could it possibly be like? Feel free to continue the story any way you like and write it as a summary of like an imaginary novel you would write.
Okay, ჩვენ ვნახეთ ორი ტრაგიკული ოჯახის ორი თაობა. წარმოიდგინეთ, რომ ნაწარმოები გრძელდება კიდევ ერთი თაობის ისტორიით. გააგრძელეთ აღნიშნული ნაწარმოები სურვილისამებრ და დაწერეთ მოკლე შინაარსი.
Feel free to send your answers to the address on the screen.
საშინაო დავალება გამოგვიგზავნეთ ეკრანზე მითითებულ მისამართზე.
Okay, Ms. Maka, it was a great discussion with our audience, with yourself as well, as always.
Yes, of course. I really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much. I think that's all for today.
I think that's all for today, and see you next week.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.